Thank you very much, Madam President. I am here once again to sound an alarm about carbon pollution's damage to our oceans and to our climate. It is past time for Congress to wake up to our responsibility as elected officials and as stewards of this planet. The alarm has been sounded by the scientific community, which overwhelmingly warns about the effects of our carbon dioxide emissions on our atmosphere and oceans. Our defense and intelligence communities warn of the threats posed by climate change to national security and international stability. Economists recognize the distortion of energy markets that overlook the true cost of carbon pollution. And government accountants now list climate change as a threat to our fiscal stability. Now, today, as we enter the Passover and Easter season, and as Catholics the world over celebrate the selection of a new pope, we turn to voices of faith. They too call upon us. They call upon us to heed the moral imperatives of protecting creation and seeking justice for all people. They call upon us to reflect on our faith, on our relationship to our world and each other, and on our responsibility to future generations. And they call upon us, as President Obama reminded us in his inaugural address, to preserve our planet commanded to our care by God. I lay no claim to religious authority, but I must believe this: something that harms others, something that disturbs God's creation, something that stands on lies and greed, protecting that must not be consistent with God's will. In his 2010 World Day of Peace message entitled, "If You Want to Cultivate Peace, Protect Creation," Pope Benedict XVI called upon the faithful, and I quote, "to protect the environment and to safeguard natural resources and the climate, while at the same time taking into due account the solidarity we owe to those living in the poorer areas of our world and to future generations." In his inaugural Mass this morning, Pope Francis said, and I quote, "Please, I would like to ask all those who have positions of responsibility in economic, political, and social life, and all men and women of goodwill, let us be protectors of creation, protectors of God's plan inscribed in nature, protectors of one another and of the environment." As early news reports indicated, the new pope chose his papal name, Francis, out of respect for St. Francis's sense of obligation to God's creation. And he noted in one of his very earliest comments that our relationship with God's creation is not so good right now. And of course, the Pope is not the only one. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I of Constantinople, the spiritual leader of the world's Orthodox Christians, also urges us to remember those most affected by climate change. Climate change is much more than an issue of environmental preservation, the Patriarch says. Climate change constitutes a matter of social and economic justice. Here in the United States, hundreds of evangelical leaders signed the Evangelical Climate Initiative Statement, which declares love of God, love of neighbor, and the demands of stewardship are more than enough reason for evangelical Christians to respond to the climate change problem with moral passion and concrete action. The Hindu Declaration on Climate Change affirms that, quote, "The dire problems besetting our world will all be magnified manyfold by the predicted impacts of climate change." And Buddhist leaders, including the Dalai Lama, urge both individual and institutional transformation to confront what they call the gravest challenge that humanity has ever faced, the ecological consequences of our own collective karma. As Reverend Fletcher Harper of the Interfaith Coalition Green Faith explains, all faith-based communities have a spiritual connection to the natural world. For example, Sheikh Ali Goma, the internationally respected Egyptian Islamist, sees this connection as central to a faithful life. I will read. "If we take seriously our role as God's deputies on earth, not just by benefiting from the environment, but by preserving it and ensuring that other communities and generations will have the same possibilities to drink clean water, breathe fresh air, and live in a world that is in harmony with itself and with ourselves, we may hope to be among those who are beloved to God due to their care for His creation." For many, Madam President, faith compels work toward fairness and justice for all living beings, regardless of nationality or social status, and encourages us to consider the effects of our actions on future generations. For many individuals all over the world, the fight against climate change is a moral call. As Americans, we have a tradition of calling upon our own deeply held spiritual convictions to address our society's greatest moral challenges. People of faith are answering that call, from major denominational governing bodies down to local parishes and synagogues. Representative Henry Waxman and I, as part of our work on the bicameral task force on climate change, recently wrote to 300 groups to ask for their views on actions the federal government could take to reduce carbon pollution and strengthen our resiliency to climate change. A number of those organizations which answered are religious organizations. And I ask unanimous consent to submit letters from 6 of these groups to the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs wrote to us that, quote, "The need to transform the world's energy economy while addressing global climate change is not only a religious and moral imperative, it is a strategy for security and survival." The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops says that, and I quote, "At its core, global climate change is not about economic theory or political platforms, nor about partisan advantage or interest group pressures. It is about the future of God's creation and one human family." The bishops asked Congress to consider 7 principles in shaping responsible climate change policies. 1, addressing global climate change means protecting the common good. 2, climate change will hit the most vulnerable communities the hardest. 3, we must seek solutions that enhance rather than diminish the economic standing of the poor. 4, new resources must be made available to poor communities to adapt to the effects of a changing climate. 5, we must protect vulnerable peoples from the negative human health effects of climate change. 6, local affected communities should have a voice in shaping the response to climate change. And 7, technological solutions to reduce carbon emissions and adapt to a changing climate must be made available to the people of developing nations. That is from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. We heard from the Quaker Friends Committee on National Legislation. They wrote that climate change, quote, is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced, end quote. The Evangelical Environment Network urges immediate bipartisan action, saying, and I quote, "The simple truth is, those opposed to climate action have done a good job of having climate change viewed as a political issue, even a partisan one. We firmly believe that the need to act to overcome climate change is a moral issue, that it should be viewed morally rather than in a partisan fashion." The National Council of the Churches of Christ, representing 37 Christian denominations, calls for a national policy that, and I quote, lifts up justice, stewardship, sustainability, and sufficiency as guiding tenets. Interfaith Power and Light, a national faith-based campaign against global warming, tells us that its 40 state affiliates and thousands of congregations view a swift and equitable transition to a clean energy economy as our moral responsibility and are prepared to support the task force's efforts every step of the way. These religious leaders and groups are, unlike Congress, not sleepwalking through history. Faith groups throughout America are acting on their sense of spirit, justice, and stewardship, and are mobilizing locally to combat and prepare for the effects of climate change. In my home state, Rhode Island Interfaith Power and Light provides free energy audits, training workshops, and online information about implementing and maintaining energy efficiency programs for houses of worship. The Jewish Alliance of Greater Rhode Island's Community Relations Council is working to reduce the carbon footprint of Rhode Island synagogues by 14% by next year. In East Providence, Rhode Island, the Newman Congregational Church made some simple changes like installing occupancy sensors and better lighting and experienced a 25% reduction in electricity costs. Last year, the Beneficent Congregational Church of the United Church of Christ in Providence undertook an ecumenical Lenten carbon fast. This spring, from Easter to Pentecost, the congregation will be taking part in the United Church of Christ's national campaign of volunteering and environmental advocacy. Madam President, these urgent calls from religious leaders of so many faiths and these conscientious actions by individual houses of worship demonstrate the powerful connection men and women of faith feel to the wonders of creation and to our fellow humankind. For some, this connection derives from a connection to a higher power. For others, it is hope for future generations or a commitment to justice for all living things. I once heard a colleague here in Congress brush off the warnings of science about climate change, saying, "God's still up there," implying that there's no need to worry about climate change. Well, if God is still up there, what better use of the gifts of moral reasoning that we have been given as His people than to protect His creation and one another from harm? Madam President, as we sing in the old hymn, "Field and forest, vale and mountain, flowering meadow, flashing sea, chanting bird and flowing fountain, call us to rejoice in Thee." We are each called in our own way to wake up and to do the right thing. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
Madam President, I just want to comment on the senator from Rhode Island's comments. First of all, I know it's so heartfelt and so genuine, and I want to thank him for that. And I want to thank him from approaching it from a faith-based standpoint about this fragile ecosystem that we live on called planet Earth. And he's brought a perspective with that chart that he had of the Earth, that it is so beautiful, and yet it looks so fragile. As a matter of fact, when you look at the rim of the Earth from the perspective in space, you see a thin film, and you realize that that's what sustains all of life, which is the atmosphere. And even with the naked eye from space, you can see how we're messing it up. I could see coming across Brazil, I could see the color differentiation where they were destroying the Amazon, and then could look to the east at the mouth of the Amazon and see the effects of the extra silt that discolored the waters of the Atlantic for hundreds of miles. And so the senator brings a great perspective, and I thank him for it. And Madam President, I yield the floor.